here, and let's go ahead and just start roll call over again.
Yep, yes, ma'am.
And, we'll have a fresh start. So Cody, please start roll call again.
Sure. Ms. Agee. Mr. Jim Chang. Here. Secretary Stephen Cummings.
Here.
Thank you. Mr. Jim Dyke.
Here.
Mr. Haywood Fralin. Mr. Ken Johnson.
Here.
Senator Lucas. Carol Quinn.
Here.
Mr. Stelmar. Delegate Torian. And Ms. Trigino.
Here. Present and accounted for.
Madam Chair, we do have a quorum.
Very good. At this time, we will open the floor for public comments. Cody, can you please recognize anyone?
Nobody has signed up in advance to make public comment.
Very good. Do we have any written comments?
We are not having written comments. We're good to go.
We're moving along. The only item that is on our consent agenda today is the approval of the January 29th minutes. Minutes,
So move approval.
right? Thank you, thank you. We have motion properly seconded. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Meeting minutes are approved. We will move to the next action item, which is a nomination, which is the purview of this committee, as you know. And this is for the chair of the regional councils. And as you will recall, as it was outlined in the governance and policy committee charter adopted at our last meeting, it's the role and responsibility of this committee to provide recommendations to the full board for non-legislative citizen members that may be well suited for leadership. Currently, the board has one basic leadership position that is created as part of the revisions to the board bylaws that were adopted at the December meeting of our board. For a little background on what this entails, the vice chair for regional councils shall be charged with the development of strategies to ensure communication between the board and regional councils. They shall create synergy among the regions and shall invite feedback from regional councils, share information on project focus and focus, and ensure that the regional councils are briefed on the direction and strategies for implementing Go Virginia mission. The vice chair for regional councils will also be the chair of the regional council committee. And so our goal for this action item is to nominate a non-legislative citizen member for the position, which will in turn serve as the recommended nominee subject to the full board approval. That will be taken up once we have a quorum at the full board. With that said, I'd like to open the floor for nominations for consideration for the position of vice chair of regional councils. Yes, Mr. Dyke.
I would like to nominate Leah for that position, for a number of different reasons. From a background perspective, she's the former vice president of community innovation at Virginia Community Capital, and is the current CEO of Virginia. But from a professional perspective, she's touched all of the bases in her most capacity. Had a chance to work with the vast array of people we have to deal with, both nonprofit, for-profit, and governmental. And I know of her enthusiasm for the board. In fact, I think literally once she had been appointed, she reached out to me and we had a nice long meeting about what the board was about and what she could do to be helpful. And then subsequently, we've been involved in some activities working with some of the regional councils to try to develop that dialogue. So I think she has an excellent background for this, and I'm enthusiastic that I would like to nominate her for that position.
Excellent.
Second the nomination.
Very good. Thank you. Are there any other nominations from the board?
Move to close the nominations.
Good. We have a nomination that has been properly seconded, which I think is a great one. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none.
I have a question.
Congratulations. Yes, sir, Ken.
I have a question. How long are those terms?
So it would be a 2-year term, and then it's subject to a 1-year renewal.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. All right, congratulations on the nomination.
Thank you. Look forward to serving.
And we will pass that along at the appropriate time in the full board meeting for votes when we have a quorum and can take that action. Okay, the next item on our agenda is the discussion of the JLARC recommendations. And we're going to review and discuss 5 items specifically today. For this portion of the meeting, I'm going to turn it over to Cody so he can walk us through these detailed items that were in the packet of materials that you received. So we're going to go over traded sector industry definitions, review of higher wage jobs, eligibility requirement, growth and diversification plan review guidance, and expanded administrative approval authority, and lastly, expansion of the competitive fund eligibility.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So as you'll see as we progress through our slides here, we can go ahead and skip past this one, Joseph. Most of these slides are built in such a way that we're going to talk about kind of what the JLARC recommendation is. I'm going to walk you through some material. In some situations like the one you have here, you're going to have a series of options that are recommended. However, discussion can ensue and these can change based on whatever the committee wants to do. And then there will be kind of a compare and contrast between what JLARC is recommending and what staff is recommending. So the first item that we're going to talk about today is JLARC recommendation 5. So this deals with traded sector industry definitions. Specifically, the language of the recommendation by JLARC is that the Virginia board should revise its policies to include a more detailed definition of traded sector activities modeled on the definition used by the Virginia Economic Development Partnerships Virginia Jobs Improvement Program, which can be used to determine project eligibility. They made a number of points when they were talking about why they thought that this was a necessary change. I'm going to walk you through those before we get to what staff is recommending. So JLARC noted that at the inception of the Go Virginia program, the board determined the program should be focused on traded sector industries. Economists and program stakeholders, including board and council members, agree that it is appropriate for the Go Virginia board to focus on growing the traded sector because these activities have the biggest potential economic impact. Traded sector activities bring in new revenue from outside of the state instead of simply reallocating existing economic activity within the state and can have more significant impact on the economy. Traded sector industries also generally pay higher wages, which we'll talk about more in detail in a couple minutes. The board policy established for traded industry sectors, which you will find in your board packet right now, it would be board policy number 4, vaguely touches on this. And really what JLARC was trying to drill down to was this really isn't as prescriptive as would be useful for stakeholders who are trying to access the program. So moving forward, I want to talk kind of about the staff perspective and a couple of different options that we've compiled for you to consider. Now, what I do want to note, the staff recommendation today is to kind of choose one of the definitions, which you can see up here on the board in front of you. And then from that point, staff will work to revise the policy and bring it before you at a future meeting so that you can make an official action and then recommend that action, that new board policy to the board itself. So the definitions in front of you, we have the BDP definition, and that is that a company that directly or indirectly derives more than 50% of its revenue from out of the state. So as you'll notice, if you've been on the board for a while, or as you've come to understand the board activities, we really view large scale capacity increases as opposed to individual company incentives. So that is the definition that was suggested by JLARC. It's staff's view that this is a little bit too specific to an incentive program. So other definitions may be more viable for the work that we do. So the following 3 definitions, and these are the ones that we've talked about most internally, and this is what we're going to open up for discussion, really is, do any of these 3 adequately suffice in terms of what we're trying to convey that we're looking for in a Go Virginia project? The first comes from the Metropolitan Council definition. This is an economic development firm that really works in the Twin Cities area. So we're talking about Minneapolis. But the definition really holds true for no matter where you are. And that's the idea that industries and firms that produce goods and services that are sold outside the region of production. I do want to make one very specific distinction here, and you're going to find this in the recommendation I'm going to talk about. And it's that region can get confusing, right? So it's this idea that as Go Virginia, we have 9 regions. When they formed this definition, they weren't thinking about Go Virginia's 9 regions. So whenever we're framing this discussion, we really want to talk about not the region, but the Commonwealth at large. So in your mind, as we're going through these, think about goods and services that are sold outside of the Commonwealth, not a specific region, just as a point of clarity. So the second definition is the traded industries are those that are more geographically concentrated and produce goods and services that are sold across regions and countries. And that fourth definition, traded industries tend to be concentrated in a few regions and serve markets beyond the region in which they are located. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't do, as I was asked by Haywood Freeland. Haywood and I got to talk, he was unable to be here today, and he just wanted me to relay to you guys that he was most interested in definition B. So he just wanted to make sure that his perspective is heard in his absence. So given those definitions, I'm going to read to you what my staff recommendation is, and we're going to open up this discussion for you guys to kind of talk about these options and kind of determine where you guys want to land and where you want to direct me to go in terms of policy. So my recommendation effectively is that we repeal board policy 4, which again is in your packet. Move a couple of those miscellaneous items that really don't pertain to traded industries, things such as scholarships, and move those to administrative guidance and really refocus that policy on traded industry sectors and what that would mean. Part of that policy change would be including a small clause that basically says that if the board chooses to adopt a proceeding policy, a policy that opens to specific traded sectors, not unlike healthcare, which was discussed earlier at committee, that would be allowed. So anything non-traded would be case by case, and board would have to make explicit actions to supersede this policy. So with that said, I want to open up the floor to any discussion, any thoughts on the item ahead of us.
So we've heard from Mr. Freeland.
We have.
Through you that he was most inclined to feel like, can we go back to that last slide for the definitions, please, just briefly? That Metropolitan Council definition was what he was most leaning towards. Are there others that have differing views or a similar view on the actual definition?
Go ahead, you can explain region in that, yeah.
Sure, of course. So when we think of regions, Go Virginia, we think of our 9 regions.
Right.
So if I was on the regional council, I'd be like, oh, so as long as my goods are sold to, if I'm 1, they're sold to region 2, right? And that really doesn't fulfill the goal of Go Virginia, bringing money into the Commonwealth. So what I want to do is replace region with Commonwealth here, so we can better, does that make sense?
So how is traded sector used? Because when you're defining a term, how it's used and the context in which it's used is probably about as relevant as you get. So when we speak of traded sectors, what are we referring to? Those are the sectors that we can make grants to. What is, I guess, that will help inform the best definition in my mind.
Sure, yeah. So when we're talking about traded sector industries here, we're talking industries that we would make grants to, that would open up and see activities that would support the growth of those sectors. So if you talk about a sector, for instance, I'll use advanced manufacturing. It's any activity that goes into the manufacturing aspects, right? To grow that industry, whether that's building up the workforce, the necessary welding, et cetera, et cetera. So it would be coalesced around that principle. If a superseding policy was adopted, yes. Now, the healthcare task force that you weren't at earlier that met did propose a new policy, it's board policy 17, that would supersede this, so it would include healthcare with very specific criteria. So there would be, under this recommendation, a pathway to enact that, while also making sure that the vast majority of the activities we do with this program are traded industry. Does that make sense?
And I know we've had this discussion before about not being able to help, so you said, but the 2 committees' recommendations, we wouldn't be able to.
Exactly. So this policy would say, we're doing traded sector, but if the board decides simultaneously that they need to pass a policy to address a non-traded industry that's affecting the economy, then they can do that. So this wouldn't gate that policy out. This would work in tandem with.
This is essentially a foundational element of building a little bit of a guardrail around what is the traded sector. Beyond that, if we find issues like healthcare that are probably pertinent to the work of Go Virginia and perhaps serving as an impediment to the traded sectors being developed within a particular region, then at that point we would address those separately, which is what is happening through the healthcare task force. So there will be, coming out of that committee, and I don't want to step on the toes of the chairman there. But there will be a recommendation coming forward that identifies 4 areas of stipulated proof points, essentially. So if a region is able to say, we meet these 4 criteria, and thereby we'd like for you to consider a healthcare project, then based on this, if the board approves it, it would be available for going to that next step and then going through the regular process of approval.
And to the chair's point, it's predicated on supporting trade sector investment. But this is an impediment to be able to actually put forward the trade sector. It's a very narrowly, you'll see later, you have a very narrowly written, but very specific one, supporting the overall objective as emphasis on trade sector investment.
Well, it means all these pieces come together
Yeah.
to say we can do something to support, for example, nursing shortage through government grants and
Very specific eligibility criteria.
but,
I
okay,
support a trade sector investment.
okay.
It's on the recommendation. I agree. I think B is the crispest. But I think you've got to add goods and services that are largely or predominantly sold outside of the region.
Sure.
I think it's they all kind of say the same thing, but I feel like that B is, in my mind, the clearest.
I'd also add simply having the potential to be sold outside the region, because there are a lot of goods and services that are produced and consumed, I will say domestically within the Commonwealth. But for firms that have aspirations for growth, obviously being able to pursue new markets outside of Virginia or people is something that we want to support. So
And the idea here today is if we can coalesce around which definition to use as the base, then staff can go forward, put that into the variance documentation, bring that back for our review and action. But I think this is just giving that direction as a starting point of where we feel like is the right pathway that we want to see it go down.
So goods and services produced in Virginia but sold outside of Virginia?
Correct. Yeah.
Do we want to say
Madam
produced?
Chair,
Yes, Mr. Johnson.
yes, the question I would have, Cody, thank you for reaching out, and I know we talked about this a little bit, but have we discussed this at all with the non-regional councils, get any feedback from them at all?
We haven't solicited feedback on this specific point. However, part of any direction that you have, for me, can certainly include that. I'm happy to make those connections and kind of reach out and see what they think and see how this interacts. I think that's quite frankly a great idea.
If you can deal with both, but the health, we've done with healthcare, a little bit of healthcare side, and also the other committee, program evaluation committee, which we chat as well.
Exactly.
And yeah, this concept of traded sector industries, I mean, it's been really kind of part of Go Virginia since its inception. I mean, the example that I always like to use is barbershops, for example, which is non-traded. We can create more barbershops, but there's only so many heads to cut, right? And so the idea here is growing the pie through increasing the amount of economic activity and revenue generation for traded sector industries. And while we spoke to this topic, I think we agree with Jay Lark that Board Policy 4 doesn't have the clarity that is needed, and to actually, come up with a universally understood definition would advantage the program. So that's the.
Just practically one point, and Ken raises the point by asking the regional council, but my recollection is they were the ones who were the ones jumping up and down saying we needed to have this, because they would come to us with, for example, a program that would help produce more nurses. And they were sort of not able to do that because they were. So I think it's excellent to get their input, but I'm intending to think that they would be supportive of anything to give them more flexibility.
And clarity.
Clarity.
And just to follow that, to get an exception, is that an exception for entire industries, or is it like a case by case, project by project example? So how do you see that?
Sure. So the way that I see this is, like Emily said, kind of a foundational policy. We're focused on traded industry sectors, right? So the way that my recommendation kind of would be structured is the policy would read, this is what Go Virginia does. We're focused on traded industry. However, a second clause that says, should the state board choose a traded industry sector or a non-traded that would benefit the economy, they may do that in superseding policy on a case-by-case basis. So for instance, in healthcare, with healthcare task force, they're really attacking the sector, but within that policy, they're creating criteria to make sure that it remains focused. Because what we always want to do as a program is, if we open up the aperture, we always want to be strategic with it. And so that would be how this is envisioned to apply.
So kind of just the other thing too, was one of the things JR said, it's a fair comment, is that eligibility should be clear to applicants before they get either you're eligible or not. We still have to decide as a board whether or not the proposed application on the merits, in terms of outcomes and things like that, meets our criteria, but people shouldn't show up and eligible or not. And that's some sense that part of this is that should be as well.
Mr. Chang, did that answer your question?
So it's case by case.
It would be
if you
sector
pass a
by,
whole
it would be
policy,
sector by
then
sector,
it would be
not
sector.
like, we don't ever want to create just like an exception for one project. So we'd be creating by sector, framework.
Okay.
That's right, committee meeting, and you're welcome to join us.
Well, I'm just going
Yes, please join us.
So if I can recap the discussion, just so I know which direction you're going to it. I'm going to work forward with a change to board policy number 4, working off of recommendation B. We want to make sure that it's explicit that we're looking for goods that are predominantly sold outside or have the potential to be predominantly sold outside. And you want me to work with stakeholders as I form that policy. Am I understanding it correctly?
That's what I,
Language, second. Language over here.
Yeah.
Excellent. Good.
great.
Good. So.
So let's move ahead to our next, knowing we've got a couple others.
Yeah, hopefully the rest of them are easy though, but we'll see where we land. So the next slide talks about a review of high wage job eligibility, and I'm not gonna read your packet to you. You guys have had access to this. If you have questions about anything in your packet or EJ or these things behind it, please let me know, stop me, and we'll kind of backtrack. But recommendation number 7 really states that the board should replace the eligibility requirement that a project create higher wage jobs. And staff recommendation really was that there isn't a requirement anywhere in the law. I did a search myself just to kind of figure that out. So what that says to me is that we're not requiring it, but it's not clear that it isn't a requirement. Now, that's not to say that it isn't an important facet of a high impact project, right? So when we talk about traded sector industries, what we're talking about are activities that would predominantly lead to high wage jobs. Now, not all jobs in those industries are going to be high wage out the gate, right? And this is a conversation that I've had with a few board members actually, is this idea that maybe it doesn't start high wage, right? Maybe it is an entry level position, but the highest impact really is getting people on that path to success, on that path to high wage jobs. So our recommendation really is for you to direct me to go through all of our documentation and really be clear that we're not requiring high wage jobs. What we're saying is we want to be strategic. We want to make sure that we're focusing on these traded industry sectors as we just talked about, and just reiterate that yes, traded industry sectors, an aspect of that is high wage jobs. So that's my recommendation, very quickly. So please go ahead.
Yeah, I just, I'm thinking in terms of average wage opportunity. Or that you need to lower wage in the workforce, but not going to come up and be a net plus to the average wage within a region. And that's kind of dilutive and not really helping progress. Especially when you think about it now, where employment rates are, for the most part, pretty darn low.
Absolutely. So I'll just reinforce kind of what Cody spoke about, and I think you and I have discussed this, is traded sector industries do by their very nature they are higher paying jobs. There's more value added, there tends to be more innovation. They really are the drivers of regional economies. Now within a given industry, and I'll use advanced manufacturing as an example, there are a wide variety of employment opportunities. But on average, sir, I think you're right. They are going to pay better than the average wage in the region. Now, we do have some very strategically important industries. Agriculture is one that I will mention, that if you just look at that sector as a standalone, not considering its ability to sell its grown products outside of the market where they're produced, you might say, well, should we do ag projects? I would argue that we should. They are absolutely traded. Really, I think, I don't remember how they ranked in terms of Virginia exports, but it's pretty significant. It's within the top 5 for sure. So that may be an example. I think what I read from the JLAC report is there was some confusion among stakeholders that were interviewed, that this higher paying jobs eligibility requirement was kind of a standalone and separate from this idea of traded sector. And I think we feel it'd be more important to really focus on the traded sector industry definition and just make sure that it is clear in all of our guidance that creating higher paying jobs is kind of a secondary factor, if you will. What we want to do is grow and diversify those industries.
It's almost that the higher paying jobs are the outcome of
Exactly.
the formula that we're setting
Well,
forward.
Exactly. One of the things I was going to suggest is perhaps if we looked at language around economic impact or economic development or economic impact with the formula associated with it. And to your point, the higher paying jobs will be secondary as a part of that.
That's a great point.
So I think I hear, does anyone disagree that we do want Cody to move ahead to look at those documents, make sure that we are clear in saying that it's not an eligibility requirement, but rather the traded sector is the focus. And we believe that the higher paying jobs are going to be the result of the traded sector focus.
Definition of traded sector even more important.
Exactly.
If that's the cornerstone, it needs to be very well crafted.
I know we talked about it. I'm thinking of, and I understand ag is kind of obvious. You need field workers and other people to do things that support the overall ecosystem. I'd struggle if there was a project where we are doing the low end of a manufacturing process and then they ship our piece of it to South Carolina to do the high value stuff.
Sure, that's a good example.
You know, it's hard to write something that is, in my mind, can be broadly applied. So, we just have this stuck on it, because we probably, on something like that, you'd say, well, what's this feeding? Oh, that's not Virginia, why would it feed us?
Yeah, I think when you get above the individual firm level and you think about the industry sector or the cluster as a whole, that may be, thinking may kind of evolve on that.
If you're doing it to support an ecosystem in Virginia, I'm all for it, right?
Yeah.
It's probably too complicated.
No, what you're right about exactly is an industry cluster definition. It is the supply chain, right? It is kind of the ecosystem of all of the inputs that are required to develop an end product. And we see a lot of regions pursuing strategies to do more value added manufacturing, because that creates a more robust supply chain, a complete supply chain, if you will. And you do need the simple things that go into the more complicated things, that go into the really complicated things.
But I think one of the comments we had last time was that we should still want to have this included in the criteria in the evaluation criteria, just like some of the others. So we don't end up with like retail salary or something. Exactly like that. Or at least we know that there's indirect effect into higher wages or more jobs or both.
Excellent one. Yeah. Okay, well, let's move on to
The next item on your agenda is curriculum diversification plan review guidance. This is a pretty simple item, I think. So state code requires that every regional council update their curriculum diversification plan every 2 years. So the first 2 cycles in which this applied to Give Virginia, each regional council hired consultants. They did full-blown rewrites of this plan. What we did this last year was just a little bit different. We looked at it and we said, maybe a full rewrite is a little bit much, right? So we developed, and you're going to find this in your packet, these lighter guidance, this ability to do light touch-ups in situations where you don't really need that full rewrite. Now, that doesn't mean that the regional councils couldn't make huge changes, which some of them did. And I would point to Region 1 as an example of deciding we want to add a new industry cluster. So they had a consultant come in and really do a lot of heavy lifting. What this recommendation is really saying is we like, and the stakeholders like, that there was more flexibility. There was an ability to do a lighter review cycle because sometimes the data doesn't change that much. So you'll find that kind of reflected in my staff recommendation. And I don't think staff is really against this idea of doing lighter and heavy cycles, right? In fact, the idea kind of started here. What I would proffer to you is to say that maybe we need to talk to our stakeholders. To Ken's point earlier about talking to regional councils, same basic thing applies here. Give us an opportunity to meet with the councils, meet with the support organizations, find out what the most appropriate and most useful cadence for these reviews would be. And then we'll support a staff recommendation for an update to the cadence of this guidance in the future. Again, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about that.
I think this one's fairly straightforward.
If you have any questions after the meeting, obviously feel free to reach out. But we'll move on to expanded administrative guidance or administrative approval authority. So as you know, the Go Virginia program allows us as staff to administratively approve projects that are of a planning nature of under $100,000. What the JLAC recommendation really said was maybe we can move faster if staff can approve all of them, as long as they're fully vetted by a group. So most of you, if not all of you, have been on one of our review groups, right? So whenever we have an application process, the applications come in, staff does a review, we have subject matter experts come in, we have you as board members come in, really look at the projects. There's a pitch call element, and then we have a feedback loop section where we'll take the questions that we developed as a work group and then have them addressed by the applicants. This all culminates in a recommendation from the work group, which the state board then considers. You'll see all of that kind of laid out in the memo that I provided. I do want to bring attention to the calendar that you see there. So when we spoke last time, I had a request to kind of look at how much time would we save if through this process, DHCD was able to administratively approve. What you're seeing in this calendar is the real world example. This is what happened in November. So you have the staff review, the work group review, feedback loop, all culminating in a recommendation, right? What JLAC did say was we love the feedback loop. We love the work group review. They're a big fan of it. And quite frankly, they stated that the stakeholders were a big fan of this. So really they want to see if we do this review and if we just have staff approve, maybe we can go a little bit faster. What I think you'll find in the material provided, we're not really going to save a whole ton of time after the work group. Should we do this? As you'll see, by the time we get the recommendation, which in December was the 6th, the board meeting was the 12th, so we're talking about 5 net days total. Now we got to talk to JLAC a little bit after the last meeting when we were talking about this one item, and they said, you know, maybe this would best benefit projects that are deferred. So what I wanted to lay out here, and you'll find this in point 5, you'll see 3 different basic recommendations that the state board and work groups use, and that's approval, deferral, and denial. And what I really wanted to best articulate in this section is really that when the state board has had applications in front of them that are only going to take a few weeks to kind of satisfy and fix up to where they can get out the door, generally the state board will do an approval contingent, right? And these are projects that only need a couple of minor tweaks. When we're talking about deferrals, which is what JLAC was kind of referring to, we're talking about projects that need a significant scope change, significant changes to the way that they operate that would take a significant amount of time. It's our view as staff that even if we did an administrative approval of those projects, it would take at least a quarter to solve those problems. And a lot of times those are problems that the work group has found themselves. And we want to make sure that those work groups are able to confirm that their concerns are adequately addressed. So the recommendation for this is that no action actually be taken because the amount of time that is saved by doing an administrative approval authority expansion would be nominal at best. I'm happy to answer any questions. I know we only have about 7 minutes, but we're nearing the end, I promise.
And then we have two information items which we
Yes.
can gloss over, but I think the point on this one, at least from my perspective, is that JLARC was hoping to be able to deploy funds in a quicker manner. And we really found through this process that the best we could do is maybe a couple weeks, and that would even be generous in deploying funds in a quicker fashion. And so I think that, at least from my seat, adhering to the structure of the process and making sure that each piece is given its due is paramount to trying to shorten that time frame for a couple weeks at best. And really, it's more a couple days in several situations, but I think the representative model was maybe a 5 working day gain, which I don't see as a value add in this particular instance. So
It's just a question more than an observation. How much time does it take to negotiate the contract with the?
That depends on the project. It can be the fastest I've done is 7 days. I've seen it take months, depending on.
That's where your numbers are getting skewed, right there.
Yeah.
So, if there's a delivery, you're talking about contract negotiation, a highly complex and pretty significant terms, which limit how they're using the intellectual property as one, which gets pretty dicey, as we know, but that's gonna skew your numbers. That's what they're looking at. It's not the board approval process, it's delivery of funds. They're not delivering any funds until the contract's negotiated.
And another point just to that, a lot of the times the board will approve something contingent because of match. And match, again, we're waiting on another funder, sometimes federal government, quite frankly, and we all know how slowly that can work. And that mucks up the process even more, makes it even longer. So even if we approve contingent, a lot of the time, it takes a long time to really qualify that match and get that project rolling.
As part of this, to that point, did we ask the regions what your thoughts about our process and how do you think what frustrates you about being in responsiveness?
I haven't done any stakeholder outreach on that, but if you'd like me to, I can.
Well, that's an interesting point.
Yeah.
JLARC.
Probably, that comment's probably coming from their interviews. Did they interview the regional council?
They did, absolutely.
How many board members did they interview?
I don't know the answer to that question.
State board members or,
State board members.
I know of at least 4. And I know they did some extensive survey work as well with regional council leadership and the support organization staff and some grantees are actual implementers of projects. So I think they really did try to get a broad range of perspective on it.
Madam Chair, is there an opportunity to propose maybe a timeline for closure for the regions?
What does that mean?
Meaning 120 days for deployment of funds, or, so that we can, folks can really hop to it once we've voted yes, make sure they have that matching where everybody's agreed that this will happen in a certain time frame, and then they can get extensions if they need it. But I think that there needs to be some teeth associated with it in order if we want this to move forward.
Mr. Johnson, we do have administrative guidance for situations in which a grantee is waiting on match. And we allow up to 1 year after a board decision for them to figure that out. Otherwise, if they don't do that, then it would have to come before the state board again.
But Ken, this is Sarah. My target for my team is to get these things under contract within 30 days. I mean, but we've certainly seen that happen more quickly. 7 days, it really depends on the readiness of the applicant to go to contract, but our goal is 30, no more than 30 days after a decision by the board.
Okay, in the interest of time, let's breeze through this last one and then we'll adjourn, knowing that we've got the full board coming up.
Yeah, I think that this last one we can really cruise through. So what we're talking about here is the expansion of competitive fund eligibility. I really like this recommendation, mainly because I think that we already did it. You're gonna find the guidance for the competitive pool in your packet. Basically, they said it's too restrictive. It's only for multi-regional projects. That's why the money isn't getting spent. Now, I'm happy to say that staff worked with stakeholders all throughout the second half of last year to really determine the best way to expand this pool, to make it easier to access. And I'm happy to say that I believe personally that we targeted and tackled a lot of the recommendations that JLARC is making here. I want to make a point to say that JLARC's report happened on December 11th. These guidance came out on December 12th, right? So they didn't know it was coming. The recommendation is that staff kind of already did this. I do want to leave it open. If you guys have read the guidance, if you read the guidance and you think, hey, I don't think that this was quite tackled by DHCD staff, please let me know. And I'm happy to re-examine. But at this point, one, I think that this was solved, and two, I think over the next couple of quarters with our pipeline, you're going to see a lot of projects that are going to take advantage of this. You're going to see a lot of high impact coming out of a change that was just a simple change to tax. Do you guys have any questions?
Great, thank you so much, and I apologize, we didn't have quite as much time as we thought we would, given some of the technical difficulties on the front end, but there are two information items that are in your packet. One is just a roadmap for addressing the additional JLARC recommendations, as well as the ones we discussed today, but the others that our group has been charged with, and so you can see our target dates there. We are also looking to have another meeting of this committee, likely in a virtual setting, potentially late May, early June, to dig into this in an additional meeting, hopefully where we have full time to be able to look at what you're going to go and do, Cody, based on our discussion today. Give us some items that we hopefully will then at that point be able to vote on for recommendation to the full board. But you can see in these information items, the timeline and where we hope to be able to adjourn this work. Hopefully at the September meeting, if we need to, we might go into the December one, depending on the needs. But, and then the last information item is just our board member terms memorandum from Cody, which outlines who we have in the group and where the current term will be ending, so that we can keep an eye on that, with that being a party. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and adjourn us so that we can move into the full board. Thank you all for being here.